Hello, everyone. Thanks for joining us today. Today we're talking about the Americans with Disabilities Act and everything a growing business needs to know. So I think this is one of those areas where I think a lot of us as employers think, well, ADA, I have to have an ADA accessible, say, bathroom, right? We're gonna have the handrails by the commode. I've got to have an ADA accessible storefront, maybe the wheelchair accessible to let customers in. But there's a whole lot more when it comes to ADA as just more than as a requirement of a business, so that we don't discriminate against customers or potential customers with disabilities, but employees. So as an employer, you have legal requirements. If you have or will have more than 15 employees, there's a whole nother level of compliance that is required for employers. And some of these things are just not that obvious. So I have a really qualified guest joining me today. So if you are a regular watcher or listener of the show, certainly you know Brian Shenker from Jackson Lewis. Brian's practice focuses on representing employers in a wide range of workplace matters, as well as preventative advice in counseling. He has extensive experience defending class and collective action lawsuits under federal and state wage and hour laws. He's successfully defended wage and hour audits conducted by the U.S. and New York State Departments of Labor, and he regularly handles cases before courts and administrative agencies involving claims of discrimination, sexual harassment, and retaliation. Brian, welcome to today's conversation.
Mike, thanks for having me. As always, a great topic. I think a lot to unpack here today with the ADA.
Yeah, I mean, I feel like we could say this about every webinar we do together, but this could be a week-long conversation. So we're going to try to hit the key points for employers and what they need to know. And I think the first thing they need to know is what the heck is it. I think it sounds self-evident. What is the Americans with Disabilities Act? Hey, you can't discriminate against people with disabilities, but put some more color on this before we kind of dive deep into the actual requirements, the compliance requirements.
Sure. So, by way of its history, the ADA was signed into law back in 1990 by George H.W. Bush and took effect 2 years later in 1992. And really since, Title 7, the Civil Rights Act of 1964, it's probably the most sweeping non-discrimination legislation we've had, at least on the federal level. So, it's very important, and, we don't want to lose sight of why it's important. It's because, here in the U.S., as well as all around the world, there are a lot of people with disabilities. I believe, I've seen statistics that some 22% of U.S. adults, have a disability. And many of these people are in our workplaces. From the U.S. Bureau of Labor Statistics, there are various fields where we see a lot more disabled individuals, like management, professional fields, sales and office, service, all have above, 20% of those people may have disabilities. In addition, the EEOC, we see, over 20,000 charges with the disability claim last year, and hundreds of millions of dollars awarded in those claims. So it's important.
Can you just speak to, so I know I'm maybe getting a little ahead of myself, but this is one of those things that I feel like, Mary Simmons and I had a conversation a few weeks back on sexual harassment, and I think you and I touched on this topic on a previous webinar also, that no one intends to sexually harass an employee, right? It's the misunderstood areas that get people in trouble. And so I would encourage people to think about this, and I'm going to ask you for some more edge case examples, if you could. If your employee has a wheelchair, or they're blind and use a cane and have a seeing eye dog, I mean, these are the easy ones to deal with, right? Because it's obvious that they have some type of a disability, then you would make accommodations for and not discriminate against them, right? Can you maybe give some examples of areas that aren't so obvious to your stat of 22% of Americans have some form of a disability. What are some of these less obvious disabilities that employers really need to be aware of?
Yeah, and that's a great point, because right, not all disabilities are obvious, and there's no magic words that will trigger the reasonable accommodation interactive process. So some of those, for instance, mental disabilities, and I think that's something that's being spoken about a lot more these days. Mental health. But mental health can trigger compliance requirements for employers. Those are things like anxiety attacks, PTSD, major depressive episodes, and the like, that substantially limit an individual's major life activities. And so maybe they aren't necessarily disabled, they may be, or they might just be regarded as disabled with respect to those mental issues. And one of the things I always preach is that communication is key in all aspects of compliance with the ADA. But that essentially when employers notice behavior or a concern about someone, and here, right, we're talking about maybe something that's a mental health issue. There should be a twofold conversation with an employee, right? Number one should be, performance-wise, right? Talk about their performance issues and where they're falling short, what the issues are. And then, the magic words the employer can say, what can I do to help you, right? It's not always coming forward with the magic bullet, but starting that conversation about what can be done to assist this individual, and creating that environment. That's often when you get this is what I need, this type of accommodation, and then you get into that interactive process.
Yeah. Okay. So we know that this is more than somebody in a wheelchair with a seeing eye dog. You have mental health. You have anxiety. You have spectrum issues. There's color blindness. There's lots of things that aren't so obvious that we need to be aware of. Maybe before we start going deeper into some of those examples, let's talk about the actual compliance requirements. And again, we hate to say it, but the answer increasingly over the years is it depends, right? Because these issues get more and more complex, and because they're more and more nuanced, right? So right. The hard fact of the matter is there's a couple hard things, right? Anybody more than 15 employees must comply with ADA. Do I have that right?
Right, and that's really right. That's the employment part. That's Title I, which covers employment discrimination based on disability. That's 15 and more, you're covered by that, and possibly your state or local law, which has a lower threshold.
Right. So we're going to be talking federal only for now. So there's the easy black and white part. Give us some of this. It depends on your business. What are the other depends categories, I guess, for what if you must comply and what you must comply with?
Yeah. So, Title III of the ADA is probably where it depends comes into play a bit more. And Title III is the part that covers public accommodations. And so, obviously quite, simply, that section applies to places of public accommodations. So, it will depend what type of business you are, whether you're just a brick and mortar business, maybe you have a website. We'll get into all those issues involving website accessibility a little bit later. But yes, whether you're a place of public accommodation can subject a company to all sorts of requirements, even outside of the employment context, to people who might want to come to your business or attempt to utilize your business's services. So that opens up a lot more in terms of compliance obligations as well.
So I do want to keep the majority of our conversation on employer-focused angle here, but just give the big buckets if you could, Brian, for things like accessibility for public access?
Sure, sure. So, accessibility, in terms of public accommodations, we're not only talking about, like I said, websites, but as you mentioned earlier, ramps, physical aspects to the business that allow someone with a handicap, or a disability to, access the goods and services that are provided to the public. So, this means, that no matter how big or small your company is, you may have obligations here. One of the areas I think of, and again, this is something I think comes up a lot more now than it had in the past, allowing service animals, right? So under the ADA, a place of public accommodation has to, may have to allow service animals. Now, nothing's quite, black and white as it is with the law here. We have service animals. On the other side, we have emotional support animals. That's one of the areas where the ADA treats those animals in different ways. That service animals must be allowed to accompany an individual. These might be individuals with PTSD or anxiety. These animals alert or protect those people. Maybe someone who has a seizure. And they're trained. On the other hand, there are emotional support animals, which the ADA doesn't recognize as service animals. And even if you have a doctor's note expressing the need for an emotional support dog or other animal, the ADA does not protect that and require that in going into a place of public accommodation, the store allow you to take emotional support animals. So that that's one of those intricacies of the ADA when it comes to these public accommodations.
So public accommodation, that's Title III. That's certainly a big part of it. So of Title 1, 2, 3, and 4, 3 being public accommodations, that's a lot of there's definitely employee impact, but a lot of just access to consumers and your customers. Where do you want to go next? Because I think Title I is the biggest impact on employees, but tell me if I'm wrong, but do you want to knock out what Title II and 4 have also?
Yeah, I mean, look, we can touch on Title 2 and 4 real quick, because I don't think we'll get into them so much today. Title 2 of the ADA really focuses on state and local governments and public transportation. And so, again, those are basically government agencies. So that's why we're not delving into that so much today. And Title 4 of the ADA, that's with regard to telecommunications. So these are things you would hear or be, you would know what these are. For instance, this requires telephone companies to provide, continued voice transmission, relay services for people with, speech or hearing impairments, closed captioning on public television. That would come under Title 4. But yeah, why don't we jump into Title I and really how this.
And so just to frame it for everybody, Brian. So Title 4, working backwards, is about telecommunications. Title 3 is about accessibility, and so there's employee and customer accessibility requirements that you need to be aware of. Title 2 is more about state government transportation. I think the meat of our conversation here is Title 1, which is employment, right? So let's go ahead and let's spend a few minutes parked here at Title 1. What are the employment requirements for ADA?
Absolutely. So like you said earlier, this applies to any company with 15 or more employees. And what we're really talking about here when it comes to applicability of the ADA to companies is reasonable accommodations, right? That's really the biggest issue that comes up with respect to employees with disabilities in the workplace, right? Obviously, we know we shouldn't intentionally discriminate against anyone with disabilities. But the accommodation process is often, where employers get tripped up, where we see a lot of litigation. typically if there's a discrimination claim for a disability, there's likely it's likely tied to an accommodation or failure to accommodate claim as well. And so these are very factually specific. I'd be lying if I told you these don't on occasion trip me up. Even the most experienced of HR individuals will get confused by these, but it's a process that really you need to go through for each individual disability. So
Brian, when you say even for an experienced person to get tripped up like yourself, are you talking about the accommodations themselves and when you need to provide them?
Right, exactly. Because there's no one size fit all, right? It may be about when to offer an accommodation, what may or may not be reasonable. And so there are many questions because again, there's so many types of disabilities, so many types of conditions that may impact someone, and for each position, it might impact their work in a different way.
So let's start at the front end of it, and in the communication of the disability or the request for accommodation. So if an employee has some stress anxiety disorder that is not visible, you obviously hired this person because you think they're capable of doing the job, and then they come to you, hey, can we have a talk? They talk about this. You're not probing for any proprietary unnecessary potentially discriminatory information, nothing HIPAA. There's no violation there if the employee's coming to you. But what if you, as the employer, suspect there's an issue? Can you? So I guess I want to carve this up in a few buckets on the identification and communication of the problem, and I want to separate that from the accommodations that we provide. So what is the employer's boundaries and responsibilities when it comes to proactively reaching out to the employee to talk about disabilities or perceived disabilities?
Right. So it's a great question, and I think I'm going to jump one step back and then I'll answer your question. But I think it all starts with having the appropriate policies and written policies and practices in place, right? So it all starts with making sure your company has a consistent, streamlined process for handling accommodation requests, right? There should be someone, maybe even more than one person, multiple people who accommodation requests should be directed to. An employee should know where to go and be given an outline of what the process will look like. I think that's the number one thing, because we want employees to feel comfortable to come forward, as opposed to the situation you mentioned where maybe they're not coming forward and we need to identify what we can do. So
the first line there is have an employee handbook, have a written policy that outlines for people that you include as part of your onboarding and training process that lays out, hey, if you have a disability or have a request for an accommodation, this is the process to follow. Am I saying that right?
Exactly. And I think sometimes I see businesses get too focused on that procedure and the formality of it. And again, even though you have a procedure, an employee who makes an off-the-cuff comment to their supervisor about some reason they're unable to do the work, which relates to a disability, that may be sufficient to trigger the company's obligations as well. So I know in almost every area we say manager training is important, but this is one too, because employees might not just mention things to HR. It might be something said to a manager, and so that's why a simple conversation on the floor with a laborer could be something that triggers the interactive process. So again,
Brian, I know supervisors and employers, they're scared to death to do something wrong, and I feel like sometimes in today's litigious society are afraid to have what may have historically just been a good human conversation. Hey, I see you're struggling with such and such. At least it appears to me you're struggling with such and such. Is everything okay? Is there anything we can do to to make things easier. I think people might be afraid of that conversation. Is that a good conversation to have? Is it risky, litigiously? What advice would you give to employers here?
No, so I would say that's exactly the conversation we want to have. That, if you see an employee who's struggling with, some aspect of their job, and, whether or not, you believe that there's a potential, medical condition or disability that's, impacting them, right? You want to have that conversation about, right, what are you doing that, what's the performance issue that's identify that. And then, right, we don't need to ask about a disability, but say, is there anything we can do to help you? Why are we having problems with this aspect of your job? And, what can I do to help you? So sometimes a simple question like that then the employee will disclose it, but it's just having that open-mindedness, to find out what the issue is for the employee.
And I think my guidance for small business owners is this is how we should probably be thinking about all performance management conversations anyway, right? If an employee is struggling, employee A is struggling compared to employee B in a certain area, if you make the assumption it's because they're a bad person, they're lazy, they're whatever, and you're assigning intent upon them without talking to them, well, maybe they're lazy. Maybe that's why the reason they stink at that job. But maybe there's something going on that you don't know in the adversarial relationship you just created with that employee by accusing him of being lazy. Boy, you're setting yourself up here if there's actually a potentially discriminatory reason for that performance that's related to disability, like maybe colorblindness. Maybe you had no idea that they were colorblind and they're having a hard time reading labels, so they're have a hard time stacking pallets in the warehouse for a certain SKU, and that's why employee A is struggling more than B. And if you create that adversarial relationship by accusing them of being lazy or not working hard, when that's the real underlying reason, you're at risk unnecessarily, and B, you're not getting the job performance you want when all you had to do was say, hey, it looks like you're struggling here. Is everything okay? Let's talk about this. Is there anything we can do to help?
Right. Yeah, absolutely. And it's all about the communication. And like you said, I mean, the interactive process starts, really once you've learned that an accommodation may be needed. But, even before that, right? I mean, you have employees, talking to employees, engaging in a dialogue, when someone's performing badly, and whether or not there's a disability issue, having that conversation will allow the company to figure out if there's a solution that will help the employee, perform their job, satisfactorily, and, allow the company to retain, what could be a productive employee. So yeah, definitely it's communication. And then, right, in those circumstances where, there's a disability, and possibly a need for an accommodation, right, that's when the interactive dialogue requirement is triggered, and you don't have to wait for the employee to come to you to request that accommodation. If you see a need for it, and you're aware of this type of some type of condition, then proactively, have that conversation, start the process, find out, what's going on. This should be really a mutual conversation when we're having, a dialogue about, what can be done to help an employee or accommodate, a certain disability.
All right, so Brian, so we kind of carved in the two buckets, right? So I think we adequately covered the identification of the concern or the disability, right? Whether it's the employee bringing it to us, that's the easy one scenario, or it's something we identify. So we got some coaching and guidance around how to have that conversation. What about the actual accommodations themselves? First of all, can you give us, it sounds like such a loosey-goosey term, can you give us a legal definition of what reasonable accommodation even means?
Sure. That's a great question. So a reasonable accommodation, is going to be a modification or an adjustment to either the work, the workplace, the work environment, that will make it possible for an individual with a disability, to perform that job. And so, a couple key things to remember. They have to be able to perform the essential functions of their job. And again, essential functions are really defined by the employer. We'll look back to the job description for that. And something that's also does not present an undue hardship to the company. Just a general statement on undue hardship. It's difficult to prove that, and it's the employer's burden to prove that some requested accommodation presents an undue hardship. This could be something that the company claims is extremely costly, or maybe because of the nature of the accommodation, it'll impact the operations in a negative way. But with respect to an undue hardship, an employer should really show that it conducted an analysis, if it's prepared to deny one on that basis.
Brian, I suspect nobody listening today thinks that they're going to create an undue hardship on their employee, just in the way no one thinks that they're intentionally sexually harassing someone, even though those behaviors may, in fact, cross the line. So, can you give some specific examples? And I think we need to play around the fringe, right? So it seems like an unreasonable request for an employee to ask for an accommodation that would cost $1 million to implement, like redesigning the entire building. That it's a 150-year-old historic house, that it's against code for me to even change. And the employee asked me to spend $1 million on making something more accessible. That would seem unreasonable to me. I don't think these are the kinds of requests that we're talking about. What I think it's more like, I have diabetes. I have don't have great circulation in my feet. I need to stand up and move around a little bit, but I'm at a computer all day. What kind of accommodation can you give me? I think that's what we're talking about, right?
Right. And yeah, a great example of what could be an undue hardship for certain companies would be a leave of absence, right? A lengthy leave of absence. Again, a leave of absence can be a reasonable accommodation, but maybe indefinite leave where we don't know when the employee is coming back, and therefore it prohibits the company from planning and setting up its operations as it would. That under the ADA may very well be an undue burden on the company. So an undue hardship. So it's a very fact intensive inquiry, but as an employer, you really want to document it. So if I have a position where there 10 people in this position and one of them needs a long leave of absence for disability, that might be reasonable because I have 9 other individuals who can collectively fill in the gap there. But if I have a one-off employer, maybe it's there are only 2 of these high-level individuals, and it's a long-term leave of absence, that could present an undue hardship to the company. So it's the same accommodation for 2 different employees, in different positions, could be reasonable for one, but not for another.
Right.
And a lot of it's about documenting that, right? For an employer, one of the key things is documenting the interactive process, because the employee might ask for an accommodation that the company feels is presents a hardship, or maybe the company believes there's a simpler solution. And so that's why it's part of a dialogue, and you want to document what the employee asked for, what the response was, and what the company might propose. Sometimes these are done via email, easy enough, that's documented. But this process of discussing accommodations, if done verbally, follow up with a written email just confirming what was discussed. This is something in litigation, I can tell you, if I had clients who documented those conversations, it would save a lot of litigation and costs down the road.
I'm wondering if you could give some more of the really no-brainer accommodation requests. I'll give one. I know at Ashore, if it's the use case I shared earlier, somebody has diabetes, poor circulation of the feet, they need to, but they're at a computer all day. We don't even blink at accommodating people with a stand-up desk, the kind you can lift up and so you can work at your computer standing up and alternate sitting down. The few $100s that those things, a good one, costs, absolute no-brainer for the removal of risk that you're not making a proper accommodation, the health benefits that come with it, and for having a more healthy, engaged employee, and if you're self-insured, healthy employees, there's actual cost savings, and then 3, just employee satisfaction. My employer, they care about me, right? I told them I had this concern, and they bought that for me. I think in the past, I have this black and white picture in my head with a sea of desks and various gender-specific roles around a secretarial pool, all typing away, where accommodations would have been laughed at. And that's not the world we live in today. We should be thinking about how do we accommodate our employees reasonably, cost-effectively, to engage them, adhere them to our corporate employment brand, make them as productive as possible, all at the same time, has the benefit of reducing risk. Can you give some more examples, 1 or 2 of these really easy, no-brainer accommodations that we should be making?
Right. Yeah. So I think, assistive devices, like you mentioned, a chair, a table that goes up and down so you can stand, or for someone who doesn't has issues with hearing or speaking, they're interpreters, or I've had clients use their apps, right? Their apps that can be used to help people with hearing issues. So those are things that can be used. Modified schedules. So very often, that's something that can be a reasonable accommodation. We're not creating new positions, but sometimes there's a vacant position, an open position that someone could fill, and that could be an accommodation instead of keeping them in their current role. And just anything that makes the workplace more readily accessible. So yeah, I think those are all good examples, but again, it's very fact specific. So as an employer, you can offer things that the employee might propose something that might not be so realistic, and that's why it's an interactive process, so you can figure out what will allow that employee to fulfill the functions of that job while being accommodated.
Brian, let me see if I can kind of put a cap on this topic, and we'll move on to our next subject. So if you're an employer over 15 employees, or you're going to be over 15 employees at some point in time, you must comply. That's black and white. So the Americans with Disabilities Act applies to you, and it's not just for your customers and access to your storefront or your bathrooms. This is making sure you don't intentionally or unintentionally discriminate based on someone's disability. And so it starts with communication. Communication is the most important thing you can do. So if the employee does not come to you with their concern saying, hey, they might not use the word, I have a disability, and here it is. That might be, hey, I struggle with such and such. And then it's an open dialogue, and it's our legal responsibility as employers to make, quote unquote, reasonable accommodations for those things, whether it's a hearing disability, a sight disability, some physical challenge that they have with strength or coordination or circulation of the bloodstream or anxiety or whatever the case may be. And I think almost definitionally, these things are very nuanced. There are plenty of really black and white cases, but a lot of this stuff is nuanced. And because it's nuanced, the most important thing you can do as an employer is to over communicate and document these communications for the accommodations you're going to make with the employees. Am I summing that up correctly, or do you think I'm missing any big components?
Yeah. No, I think that's absolutely right. And I'll just add, one point, which I think is often, overlooked by employers, is that, the process doesn't end when you reasonably accommodate an employee. After an accommodation is provided, there should be subsequent follow-up to ensure that the accommodation is helping the employee, is working for the employee. And on the other hand, you should follow up with the supervisor or manager to make sure that that accommodation is effective and that it's allowing the employee to perform the functions of the job and not having a negative result in terms of your operations. So I think that interactive process continues even after an accommodation is done, granted or denied, because you want to make sure that it remains effective for the employee.
Right. Hey, one last thing I wanted to touch on, and I forgot in this part of our conversation. We talked about identification of the issues and communication and accommodations for the employees and which employers must comply. But what about pre-employment? Because the law says it's not just about intentionally discrimination. You can't even unintentionally discriminate, and that includes prospective employees. What guidance? This is a whole webinar in of itself. But what guidance would you give employers for how to think about how to avoid unintentional discrimination in the application process?
Yeah, so great point. And I think the application process, we can divide it into maybe two categories, right? The pre-offer stage and the post-offer stage. So, employers are, much more limited in what they can offer at that, pre-offer stage when someone's just applying. Again, there's some basics here, right? That should be somewhat obvious, but don't ask questions about a disability, right? If someone walks in and you see them in a leg brace or crutches, don't ask that. You interview them, but don't ask. You don't need to ask them about that interview, about that disability, and during the interview. Don't ask general questions about disabilities that are trying to get some information. Like, whether do you have any disabilities that would prevent you from performing this job? More so ask job-related questions, such as, can you carry, a 40-pound crate with or without an accommodation, where they can answer that without disclosing, a disability. So again, at the, pre-job offer stage, we're really asking things that are about the job, that are job-related. And so again, that's why I think job descriptions and accurate and updated job descriptions are very important, because there might be some aspects of a job you want to ask about. But again, should a legal assistant, should they be asked, can you walk up and down stairs? Can you carry 30 pounds? They might never be required to do that. So we want to make sure that our, job descriptions that we're interviewing for, are accurate, and that, when we're asking things about them, it is in fact, job related. And then look, when we're at the offer stage, when an offer of employment has been made, then there's a little more, right? Then, at that stage, even early on, right? If an employee mentions something that could trigger the accommodation discussion, that's it. It might start before they've actually begun employment or, set foot in your building, right? If they've mentioned something, we need to start that process. Of course, there are a few, I can give you a few interview questions that would, be, bad ones to ask, such as, how many sick days did you take for your previous employer, or have you been injured on the job before, or you're in good health? Those are things we want to stay away from. Again, we really just want to ask job-related issues, and not get at whether there's a disability or issue through seemingly benign questions. So that's really the idea of what to do and not to do at that pre-hiring stage.
You know what? It's good compliance to the law requires good management practices, right? And so if you have a candidate with coming in with crutches, there's obviously something physical going on. You know, you can't say, hey, you got crutches, are you sure you're up to this job? You're instantly in terrible position, right? But it forces you to have planned out and written a good job description, understand the actual requirements of the job. So therefore, a question like this job requires the ability to lift and carry up to 40 pounds above the waist for 100 feet at a time. Is that something you're able to do, right? Am I thinking about it right, Brian?
Yeah.
The prior is a horrible question. The latter is a perfectly reasonable question.
Right, because you're getting towards what the job is about, not about some characteristic of this person or condition of this person.
Right.
Exactly.
So the right approach is harder because it requires more planning. You're going to have job descriptions actually written. You're going to have handbooks actually written. They're going to have to be more well thought out, but it saves you in the long run, and it results in a more productive workforce. So, okay, we covered pre-employment, we covered employment. Let's move on to a topic that I think a lot of people just have no idea is even a legal responsibility, and that's the website. What can you tell employers about their legal obligation to have an ADA compliant website?
Sure. So there's a lot to unpack here. I'll just start out with a blanket statement that if this is not something you've looked into, look into it, because this is actually we're seeing the greatest amount of litigation right now in terms of the ADA. So, I mean, look, when the ADA was created in the early 90s, I think the internet existed, but nowhere near like it does today. And so, Title III of the ADA doesn't really say anything about the internet and company websites and whether they're places of public accommodation. But what we can speak to is what the current legal landscape says, and there has been Department of Justice guidance just this year on website accessibility, and we've seen a lot come down in terms of litigation and what the courts say. So obviously, what's the problem? Right, we have a lot of people in the U.S. who have hearing or visual impairments that affect their ability to communicate with websites or otherwise use the internet. So what we're looking at here is typically the allegations in a website accessibility case are that a private company qualifies as a place of public accommodation, and that the website has barriers that deny that individual the right of equal access. So these are being filed, thousands and thousands of these each year. They are really shooting up in terms of the level of litigation. So right now there's actually a split in terms of the federal courts on what they say about these. So there are a few circuit courts, the First, Fourth, and Seventh Circuits, that have found that websites can be a place of public accommodation, and therefore there are requirements. You need to remove barriers. We'll discuss what those may be, and then there's some other circuits that have concluded they're not actual places of public accommodation, that public accommodation places must be a physical place. There's I could tell you about the 11th Circuit down in Florida. I mean, that federal court has kind of gone back and forth on this. It's almost like a legal soap opera, I'd say. But they have determined and then gone back as to whether websites need to be websites are subject to the ADA's requirements. But what I'll really focus on now, that's the litigation. We don't know, but that's the best I can say. Look at your specific jurisdiction. But the Department of Justice just a few months ago, issued some really important and potentially helpful guidance. It still leaves some questions open, but they issued guidance on how we should look at websites and accommodations. So basically, the DOJ addressed several areas that websites have issues in accessibility. Poor color contrast, use of colors to give info alone and not words, lack of captioning for deaf or hearing disabled individuals, inaccessible online forms, different ways to navigate instead of just a mouse. These are all things that could potentially prohibit certain people from using your company's website. So the DOJ has given us some things to consider. So I'll go through some of I think what are the best practices for website compliance, because given the split in the courts, and that their Congress hasn't acted to put through regulation, we're really looking at this DOJ guidance. So my first recommendation here would be whenever you're building a new website or redesigning one, accessibility should be part of the planning and the design, right? Yep. So there's something called the WCAG. I'm blanking on what it actually stands for, but it basically talks about compliance for websites. So the first would be talk to your website designer, tell them you want it WCAG compliant. I think we're at WCAG 2.0. And so there's certain things that means that it should be perceivable, it should be operable, understandable, and robust. Again, I'm no website specialist, but what does this generally mean, right? That your website should be perceivable, right? It shouldn't be invisible to some part of someone's senses. Operable means that even if someone's disabled, they should be able to operate your website. The interface shouldn't require an interaction that someone who's deaf or blind can't do. It should be understandable in that it should be simple enough that someone trying to use it should understand how to operate the user interface of the website. And robust means as technologies advance, these accessibility portions are advancing with it, right? That you just don't have this old 2000 website for people with accessibility issues while you've advanced the rest of your website much farther. So those are some things to consider. But
one of the things I think, so a couple of thoughts I have on this is, I think our guidance for employers would be increasingly your website. It's let's go back 20 years. Your website was probably some digital sales collateral, right? So maybe ADA interpretations had not advanced that far. And forgive me for taking a shot at your industry, Brian. Maybe the ambulance chasers hadn't jumped on board finding ways to sue over non-ADA compliant websites. But I think it's safe to say early websites were ugly. They were text only, maybe a few basic images. And it was sales collateral. It was marketing materials. Today, the website for a company is in fact your storefront. And if your storefront has to be wheelchair accessible and in wheelchair accessible bathrooms and be an ADA compliant lobby to enter your place of business, that's what your website is increasingly over time. So I think employers need to think about their websites as that. It is the store. It is the lobby of your business, right? And so things like, well, gosh, what's wrong with a bunch of images that makes my website look beautiful? Well, I'm getting wonky here as a marketing guy, but if a person with a vision disability has a plugin in their web browser that reads text in speaks text, so it's text to audio. They listen to your website. They don't read because they can't read. They can't see the text. But if all you have is images without alt text, it's called, describing what that image is, they can't interpret and consume your website. So this gets really complex, really fast. But to me, the guidance here is for employers is, especially if you're a small employer, you're 15 and a half employees, right? You might not have the deep pockets to go build a 30 or 50,000 WCG compliant website. But use some common sense and think about your website as a storefront that you must make ADA compliant, just as you do a brick and mortar business.
Yeah, absolutely. So important, because, you know, and I may have even, I want to upplay this more, because I don't think it, you know, there are plaintiffs firms and plaintiffs out there who are just going through websites. I don't know, maybe they're going through a phone book, you know, but they are just picking businesses, going to the website, whether there's a true intention to use that company's services or not. And they are either actually trying to use it, and then they're going to note the deficiencies in the website, or they're testers. There are tester plaintiffs who are doing this for a living, and they are filing, you know, dozens of lawsuits a week or a month, and, you know, they're, you know, obtaining, you know, quick settlements, injunctive relief, as to all this stuff. And so, you know, this is not just, you know, people coming to your business who, you know, you may know if an individual comes to your business and, you know, encounters a physical barrier and raises that, right? That might be something you're aware of. These are people you've never dealt with, and they can go file a lawsuit because they've gone to your website.
Right.
So, you know, look, for companies and businesses that either don't want to or don't have the resources, again, that's understandable, but you know, consider the latest litigation developments in your jurisdiction, because there is very possibly, you know, exposure, you know, given this very active plaintiff's bar. So there might be, you know, it might be worthwhile to just consider making accessible some portions of the website, right? Maybe just the most heavily trafficked pages, the landing pages, because again, there isn't guidance right now as to whether a company's whole website needs to be, you know, accessible and compliant with the WCAG, you know, standards. So, you know, companies, even if you're proactively, you know, complying, you know, maybe you want to just first focus on those more heavily trafficked pages and the parts that are tied towards, you know, your public accommodation, your, you know, and selling of goods, and then focus on those lesser used pages after that. You know, but no matter what steps, yep, go ahead.
What guidance do you give employers for, because increasingly a website, I mean, I think we're talking here in the context of a public facing external website, but increasingly an intranet, aka a website for employees, is a substantial part of the job. So if you're an employee at Assure, I mean, you're in email and you're in Teams chat, but you're in SharePoint, which is a website. You're in the intranet getting forms and how do I request time off? What are our vacation policies? It's all in the intranet. It's a website, internal. What guidance do you give employers for internal facing websites?
Yeah, very much these same things that, right? Consider a you know, a deaf employee that you have. Are they going to be able to, you know, go in and take that training off your intranet, or, you know, are they, you know, someone you know, who has a vision, you know, disability? Are they going to be able to, you know, find, you know, what they need and fill out a form? So yeah, these very same considerations should be thought about for, you know, a company's, you know, internal website, because again, you know, that those issues might very well come up, you know, under, you know, Title I, the employment portion, but it would be just as pertinent as to, you know, what a reasonable accommodation is. And look, you know, if you have, you know, for instance, deaf employees, or you know, there are lots of things you need to do, you know, even you know, something that's, you know, announced at a meeting, right? do you need an interpreter there? So, the same thing, applies for what's going to be conveyed to employees, over an intranet, certainly.
Yeah. Hey, Brian, we're about at time. Last topic I wanted to hit here, and let's just spend 2 minutes on it if we could. We don't want to scare the heck out of everybody here, but we want everybody to understand what the real life consequences can be. Speak to fines for non-compliance. Maybe first, who's the regulatory body that manages this stuff? And where do consequences happen? Is it, like I know it's Department of Labor doing a wage and hour audit. That's not how this plays out. This commonly plays out in the courts as a form of a lawsuit.
Right. So, we were talking about public accommodations under Title III. So let's start with that. Then we can get into the employment. But so for public accommodations, so like we said, it could be private enforcement. There could be, a potential customer who files a lawsuit through their attorney, and they can obtain injunctive relief, such as an order that the company bring its website up to WCAG compliance standards, right? That might be something that's ordered by a court. They can obtain attorney's fees, which is where they leverage their settlements in these cases, because if you litigate over a website compliance case, it's going to be costly, and then you're building up attorney's fees on the other side that you may very well pay at the end of the case. And so, those private, actions are a problem. But then, look, the Department of Justice, they're the enforcement arm here, and the Civil Rights Division can assess civil money damages for ADA violations, up to $75,000 for a first violation and $150,000 for subsequent violations. So, this is not, small change we're dealing with. In some instances, attorney generals can bring cases, in situations of, public interest, alleging pattern and practice discrimination. So there are lots of ways you can, get hit with one of these. And look, and then the simple area, right? The employment context, which is similar to other, Title VII areas, is look, there's regular damages for discriminating against an individual or failing to accommodate, front and back pay, right? That gives them damages for suffering actual economic damages if they, lost their job, for example. Emotional distress, and also, punitive damages, where, the conduct was, malicious and intentional. Now, under the ADA, these damages are capped depending on the size of the employer. With 15 to 100 employees, you're capped at 50,000 in punitives and emotional distress, all the way up to companies with 500 plus employees are capped at 300,000. But again, beware, that there may be other damages as well. So lots of reasons to come into compliance here.
Brian, am I oversimplifying to say lots of money, at least up to $50,000 fines for doing it wrong if a regulatory body comes in, inspects, and says you're doing it wrong, but the real risk is the cost to defend a lawsuit, whether it's frivolous or not, and if it's not frivolous, the actual payouts of lawsuits. That's where probably the most potential expense and risk sits for employers. Is that accurate?
Exactly. And look, typically the cost of compliance or substantial compliance is much less than those litigation costs.
Absolutely. Always. All right, Brian, I think we're at time here. As always, this is just so complex. I feel like, in past decades, the big laws don't discriminate based on race, age, religion, gender. These are easy things, super black and white, easy to follow. Increasingly, things like ADA is pretty nuanced in and of itself. And then you enter in the state's versions of their own ADA laws. This stuff, I think it's clear today, Brian does this for a living, and it feels like to me almost everything is an edge case. It's just really, really nuanced. And so I think the most important thing you can do is have great policies and procedures in place, handbooks, job descriptions. Most small employers can't do it. They don't have a SHRM certified person on staff. They couldn't afford the $90,000 to $110,000 that would cost to hire that person. And you don't have the expertise without it. So this is exactly what we do is we count beyond providing payroll and HR and time and attendance software and tax filing services for employers. We provide these outsourced human resource services. We'll meet you where you're at, whether you just need a little bit of help or a lot of help with our HR support for managers, strategic HR support for managers, or total HR for your entire workforce, where we truly become your outsourced HR function. All of this at an absolute fraction of the cost of trying to hire in-house staff. So if you're interested, please reach out to us after this webinar. We'd love to talk to you. Brian, I'll give you 20 seconds to talk about Jackson Lewis and how you guys help companies.
Sure, of course. And so we're a nationwide employment defense firm. We represent and help companies in all parts of the employment relationship. And certainly whether it's guiding companies on legal issues with respect to disability and accommodations or website compliance, or unfortunately litigating a matter and defending it, we are there to help employers.
All right, Brian, as always, enjoy our conversations, and everyone else, if there's anything we can do to help grow your business by getting the most out of your human capital and staying compliant in the process, we'd love to talk. Until next week, Brian, thank you. Talk to you again sometime in the near future, I'm sure, and we'll talk to everybody else next week.
Thanks a lot.